resume recording. So we're now recording. You should get a little thingy that says we're recording. So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming back to our wonderful Learning Sciences and Friends brown bag. Today we have the wonderful Lama Jaber coming and talking to us. She's an associate professor of science education at Florida State University in the School of Teacher Education. Earned her PhD in science education from Tufts, holds a bachelor degree in chemistry and a teaching diploma and a master's degree in science education from the American University of Beirut in Lebanon, where she taught elementary, middle, and high school science prior to coming to the US. Her research explores learners' disciplinary engagement in science in various contexts, focusing on the affective and epistemological dynamics within that engagement, both face-to-face and online learning environments. She's collaborated with colleagues from Tufts to develop a set of case studies of students' disciplinary engagements and persistence in science. And she's interested in the study and design of responsive teaching classrooms that promote engagement and agency. She has a NSF career grant, and I think that the talk that we're going to hear today is coming out of that work, studying and cultivating teachers' epistemic empathy. She has recently won the NARST 2021 Early Career Research Award, and she serves as an associate editor on the Journal of Research and Science Teaching, and is on the editorial board of Science Education, and of course does many other reviews and service for our community. So we appreciate her being with us today, and the title of the talk is Epistemic Empathy as a Target for Teacher Learning. And without further ado, I'd like everyone to please welcome Dr. Jaber, and I am turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duncan, for this wonderful introduction, and also for inviting me to be part of this of your meetings, like brown bag of Learning Sciences and Friends. I'm happy to be one of your friends and learning sciences myself. So thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm excited to get a chance to share some of the ideas that I've been thinking about with colleagues. And so let me start by perhaps sharing my screen. And we tried it, so it should work. Let's see. All right. Okay. All right. So, and first I would like also to acknowledge that this work is the product of lots and lots of conversations and opportunities for learning with other folks. So as they say in academia, it takes a village to do the work that we do. So this is the product of work with colleagues, teachers, students, mentors over the years that have come to shape how I think about teacher education and an aspect of teacher education that I'm referring to in my current work as epistemic empathy. So I'm excited to particularly to talk to your group about this notion of epistemic empathy, given all the work that foundational work and lots of insights and generous work that you've done with the community to push us to think about epistemic cognition and all work related to this notion of epistemic spaces that we find ourselves in. So with that, I think the way I would love to motivate this talk is to situate it in my earlier work in around focusing on student learning and students engagement. And I will say that initially when I came to this work as a PhD student myself, I was very much driven to understand what is going on for our students in the classroom. And I was really honing in on learners' experiences and not so much onto like the other side of it, which is the teaching side and teacher learning and working with teachers themselves. So I was really kind of earlier on focusing on understanding the experiences of learners. So I had a chance to work on a project with Dr. David Hammer, my former advisor and my lifelong mentor and friend, on a project called the Responsive Teaching Project. And this is where I met Sandra, one of the students that I got the chance to work with and learn about in this project. So I'm going to start by introducing you to Sandra and tell you a little bit about her experiences. And again, all of this is kind of to situate how I came to think about more recently in my interest working with teachers and thinking about the notion of epistemic empathy and its relevant for their own learning. So I met Sandra, as I said, in our responsive teaching project. And this was a project where we worked closely with elementary and middle school teachers to support them to be more attentive and responsive to learners' curiosities and questions and what learners bring to the table in terms of the everyday experiences and ways of thinking, to consider those as the resources that teachers can use for their instructional decision-making in moment-to-moment interactions with the students. So in that project, I got a chance to, Sandra was one of the students in our project who was from grade 4 to grade 7 in the participating teachers' classrooms. And Sandra is a Hispanic student, Hispanic girl, who I got a chance to learn about her experiences throughout, but finally got a chance to meet her when she was in grade 6. And I interviewed her when she was in grade 6 and grade 7. And when I interviewed Sandra, when I started the interview, I said, this is going to be talking about science. And she said to me, oh, I love science. And she goes on to say, me, science, you know, when you like someone, it's like you and somebody else. And I'm that person, and science is the other person that I'm hooked into. And so that kind of interested me, and I asked her further to say more about that and to reflect on her experiences in the classroom that she was part of in the project. We also had a chance to kind of watch some videos from her classroom, so as kind of a refresher of some of the things. And I'm going to kind of invite you to take a listen to some of what Sandra shared with me as she reflected back on her experiences in the project. And I need to make sure that I'm sharing the sound, so let me see if that will work. Okay.
On a book, it says what the author thinks. It doesn't say what the kids think.
Right.
But when you have a group discussion, it's what you think. And when you have a group discussion and somebody says something, you say, oh yeah, I want to add on that. Especially when we talked about the puddles. Most kids, they stuck with the same thing, evaporation, but then everybody's mind expanded into different things of what happened to the water. In fact, when we first started, there was so many different responses flying back and forth, and just by one question, all those opinions came flying out. That's why I like science, because one question can bring out everything that you think about that. Yeah. That's what I think. It can bring out everything.
So I'm interested in sharing this clip because to me, kind of Sandra's story here invites us to think about what was powerful in her learning experiences in the project, in the classroom, participating classroom in our project. And it is striking to me how much Sandra describes and the kind of joy and the kind of pleasures she experienced when she was able to see herself in those classrooms as someone who has ideas that she could contribute, as someone who could be sense-making with other people's thinking, who could engage her peers' thinking, reason with them about phenomena, and how much of a fascination she experienced when thinking about particular physical phenomena got her to expand her ways of thinking about the world in all these different ways, how she talks about this back and forth of ideas as something that is fascinating to her. We can almost hear her fascination and a sense of exhilaration as she reflects back on those opportunities that she had in her classroom to feel that she can be a kind of creator and critic of ideas with others in those spaces. So with that, I would say that at the time that I interviewed Sandra, she was around 11 years old. And we have some evidence throughout this project that Sandra has established some sense of sustained interest in science through the classrooms. But we also have, unfortunately, lots of evidence from research that students, and particularly those students who has been traditionally marginalized in science classrooms, students from underrepresented populations, such as girls, students of color, brown and Black kids, children who come from linguistically diverse backgrounds, immigrant students, lots of evidence that these students in particular, starting as early as age 10, start to feel that science is something that is not for them. Science is something that they shy away from, that they're not interested in. And they can kind of sense that their ways of knowing and feeling and being are kind of excluded in science spaces, or what is expected to be successful in science classrooms. So in some ways, Sandra's story presents a kind of a more hopeful picture of what is going on. And her story invites me to think about how can we design learning environments where all learners, and particularly learners who have been marginalized in STEM learning spaces, can be invited to be their whole selves and to feel that this is a place for them where they can belong, thrive, and experience the joys of science. And before I turn to this question of design of these learning environments and what that entails for thinking about pedagogy, I want to invite you to, I want to introduce you to another student I was also fortunate to meet. Her name is Maria. And when I met Maria, she was an undergraduate student in a physics course. And she was, actually, the course was taught by David Hammer, and David was also teaching this course in ways that embody principles of responsive teaching, really inviting his students to approach physics with an eye towards how you can think about your everyday experiences and reconcile inconsistencies and think about what you experience in the world as really something, the stuff of learning physics. So thinking of physics as a refinement of everyday thinking, drawing from Einstein's famous quote on that. So Maria initially started this class feeling that this is not the place for her. I got to meet her thanks to Jennifer Radoff, who at the time was a TA, a teaching assistant or learning assistant in this course, actually teaching assistant in this course. And she noticed Maria expressing lots of anxiety at the beginning of the course, but she also saw throughout the course that Maria has transformed in the way she engaged and participated. So she invited me to interview Maria at the end of the course, and I would like for you to take a listen to Maria again as she reflected back on her experiences in the course. So let me...
I've always been intimidated by physics because it's physics, you know. And physics, actually, this semester was a big trigger for me with anxiety. As an outsider, it just looks really complex. And it was like, it was really interesting, but I didn't think I could do it. It was like, it's really interesting, but do I really have the brains for that? I'm not sure. But I reached a point with the way we were like doing this class where I was more fascinated than intimidated. It started being like, if I don't know the answer, then, oh goody, we have another problem to solve. Oh, we have this big problem, you know, and it's like so complex, and it's scary, but it's also exciting because let's see if we can figure this out, you know, and when you do, it's so rewarding in the end because like, it's just, I don't know, it's such a high when you figure something out, you're just so excited, and I was so fascinated that the anxiety didn't matter anymore, and that's really significant.
So again, I show this story because to me, Maria's story is another story of hope. We could see easily, we could anticipate or imagine that given other conditions or other circumstances, Maria could have come into this course feeling that physics is, as an outsider to physics, like that's how she positions herself, feeling that physics is way above her head. And she could have easily felt that, you know, this is not the space for me, and continued to feel disempowered when she was experiencing those moments of uncertainty and confusion and feel intimidated by them, instead of coming to see them as something that she is actually, she can really wrestle with. This is part of what we do in physics. And really, I can sit with that uncertainty and I can come to figure things out. And I find that pleasurable. I derive some sense of excitement from that. So to me, what strikes me in Maria's story is that her story of transformation in this course reflects how much again, emotions, the emotions that she was experiencing in moments of sense-making in physics, when she was faced with uncertainty and confusion, how she was able to reframe some of that into feelings of excitement, feelings of anticipation of something pleasurable instead of some sense of intimidation and insecurity. And part of that was really tightly entangled with her sense of what doing physics means. So, right, her epistemology in terms of what that discipline is about, what confusion counts for in physics, what is the space of uncertainty in physics, as connected with the kinds of emotions that she was able to reframe and reorient to herself as someone who belongs in this space, as someone who can participate meaningfully in this space. So again, I want to highlight kind of a couple of things that I would love for us to kind of take away from these two stories. So first, in my earlier work, these kinds of stories and many other student stories led me to think about this notion of the close entwinement of affect and cognition, and how the emotions that we feel as we wrestle with phenomena, as we figure things out, as we face uncertainty, are part and parcel of how we make sense of and learn science, and how to think about the kinds of various feelings not as separate from the work of science and of cognition, but as part and parcel of the sense-making process. So that includes the sense of vexation when we face some inconsistencies, the sense of puzzlement over phenomenon, the anticipation of the pleasure of finding something out, and recognizing that part of learning science is learning to wrestle with those feelings and come to embrace them and come to manage and navigate them in some ways. And that earlier on led me to this notion of epistemic affect as what we should be thinking about as we think about the goals of instruction, is to really work with our students to attend to and be supportive of their experience of affect as they're learning to engage the discipline. But the other part of the story, which leads me to where I am now, is that Maria and Sandra and other students' stories similar to those invite me to think about about the power of teaching. Teaching is a powerful act, right? And if we think about what allowed these two students to come to identify with science, and including for someone like Maria, who was feeling at the beginning that she may drop the course, to come to say, I want to minor in physics. And for someone like Sandra to say, science, me and science, I'm that person and science is the other person that I'm hooked into. I think these stories, what I'm referring to as stories of hope, invite me to think about what can we do to support teachers to be able to approach their instructions in ways that allow students like Maria, like Sandra, and particularly, again, students who have been historically marginalized in those STEM learning spaces to come to view themselves as agentive students with valuable ideas to contribute, as people who can meaningfully engage the discipline. So what does it mean for us to think about instruction whereby in moment-to-moment interactions with the students, we can really embrace their experiences, including their vulnerabilities, their insecurities, their puzzlements, their excitements, so their whole selves as thinkers, as feelers in the spaces of learning. And this led me to think about the notion of epistemic empathy. And so in thinking about this idea of designing pedagogies and learning environments that recognize and honor and elevate learners' varied ways of knowing, of being, and of feeling in science, we think about the work that teachers need to do to be able to tune themselves to the students' intellectual and emotional experiences. And that's not necessarily an easy work to be doing, because our students are coming to us from varied places with perhaps frames and expectations and prior encounters with the discipline that do not resonate with ours, right? So there's, what does it mean to be able to be attentive and be able to see where students are coming from when their experiences and ways of thinking and ways of engaging may be very different from what we're bringing to the table. So that entails to me a sense of the need to be able to foster this capacity for decentering from one's own perspective, to be able to consider and make sense of learners' own meaning-making experiences in ways that could be deeply humanizing to our students. So I argue in this, in my work, that epistemic empathy and cultivating this, this in our teachers would support them to make deliberate choices about how to view and interpret and respond to students' contributions in moment-to-moment interactions in ways that can disrupt patterns of oppression and exclusion that have served to marginalize students of color and other historically underserved students in STEM learning places. So in some ways, if we think about this cultivating teachers' capacity to be in moments where student is expressing a vulnerability, or in moments where students is bringing an idea to the table that is not what the teachers has anticipated, or that is not what has been traditionally normalized in a science classroom. How can, in that moment, a teacher take a stance of humility and curiosity before making a judgment about what that student is doing? Including to say, right, this is not for our classroom, or this is not allowed in this space, to be able to really see where that student is coming from. What is the line of reasoning that they're bringing to the table in that moment? And in that work, decide to choose to respond to them as sensible human beings. How much that could have power to change the experiences of our students, especially those who have seen themselves as traditionally excluded in those science places. And so this is where I feel like there's power in this notion of epistemic empathy to support all learners to develop a sense of belonging and engagement in our classrooms in ways that have implication for issues of epistemic justice in thinking about the design of our science education classes. So in my current work, and I would say that some of this work is also very much informed by Deborah Bull's perspective on this notion of discretionary spaces, and how teachers in moments of interactions with students have lots of discretion for how to respond to learners in ways that could either elevate or could be really doing harm to students. And I think it starts with the assumption, right, that a disposition to learners as sensible human beings, so an asset-based orientations to learner. So this led me to think about the importance of cultivating teachers' epistemic empathy in my current NSF career grant in ways that could hopefully support the design of more expansive and equitable responsive teaching practices, the design and enactment of those practices. So in this graph, I really kind of represent how I see epistemic empathy as a driver or mechanism that could support the enactment of these teaching practices. In some ways, when we think about responsive teaching, we could think about different moves that a teacher can engage in, including some talk moves that teachers can do. But what I'm wondering in this work is, instead of focusing on just the kind of the specific moves that we could work on to design responsive teaching, it's important to also consider how we can cultivate a stance of empathy that starts with an ability to put on hold our assumptions, to be able to see and value where learners are coming from, to be able to tune into their intellectual and affective experiences within an epistemic experience in our classroom. And I do talk about empathy as epistemic to kind of distinguish it or demarcate it from other work that has talked about empathy more generally as social empathy or humanistic empathy, which is absolutely very important to think about when we think about teaching. But that work, especially in teacher education, has considered teachers' empathy mostly with respect to students' experiences outside of the epistemic spaces, right? So empathizing with learners, maybe a learner going through a difficult situation at home. So a teacher is kind of empathizing at this level with the learner, but not necessarily always seeing those as in service of and targeting the epistemic work that learners are engaged in. I'm going to pause for a little bit to see if people have questions before I kind of move on to the second part of the talk, which is going to focus more on this notion of epistemic empathy.
Any questions?
I have one. Could you talk a little more about how epistemic empathy? I mean, there are notions in the field that the artificial intelligence systems were designed to build models of, students' understanding. That seems like it has a little bit analogous, and of course, teachers have been encouraged to gain an understanding, in the conceptual change days of students' alternative models. So could you enlarge a little bit about how you're thinking about epistemic agency and the extent to which it overlaps and is distinct from some of those earlier notions?
Yeah, let me make sure I understand the question. So you're wondering what's the connection between this notion of epistemic empathy and earlier work that has focused on thinking about how we can come to see how, like, for example, work on, do you have specific things in mind that you're thinking
Well,
about?
let's just say, I'll just use a simple example, but I think that one thing you probably mean epistemic agency is also insights into ways of knowing, but certainly, since the early days of conceptual change work, teachers have been encouraged to sort of build a model of what students' understanding is of the, of the current scientific topic. It's easy to imagine extending that to they should understand, what their current argumentation practices are or their current modeling practices are. But I have a sense that your idea goes beyond that, and I wonder if you could talk about that.
I see. Yes, thank you. Yes, indeed. I think I think that there's some intersection with that for sure. And part of engaging in the work of epistemically empathizing with learners is to sitting with their thinking to see and try to construct what could be a model, what could be their conceptual model of something, what could be their current understanding of something. But it also goes beyond that to really encompass the whole human experience of meaning making. And that includes the kinds of emotional experiences that come for learners in those moments. So I think we have traditionally focused a lot in science education in our field on this notion of privileging perhaps the conceptual element of learners' thinking without considering deeply how that is also in moments of sense making, people are their whole selves in those moments. So they have feelings associated with that. They have other cultural, like their thinking is happening against this cultural backdrop that they're bringing to the table. They have everyday encounters and experiences with the world that become part of the resources that they draw upon in meaning making. So I feel what I'm hoping to push for is that expand our way of thinking about connecting with students beyond just how their conceptual model of an idea or their current idea about a phenomenon, but also to think about how is it that they're putting this together, drawing on all these elements of the human experience, right? The culture, the feeling, the language, the different kinds of things that come to play for them to come to shape a particular way of understanding and a particular way of communicating as well. Because sometimes too, it's not just I think, again, talking about how that extend beyond just the model, sometimes in the way students are performing and communicating an idea, their ways of engaging could be very different from what the teacher is expecting, could be very different from what has been considered as normalized, in, let's say, a physics space. And a student is coming and talking about something in a storytelling way, in very animated way, drawing on analogies and metaphors from, like, I have this wonderful example that I came across recently and I've been using in my classroom of an undergraduate physics course, physics setting, where one student's talking about energy and to represent and model the bouncing ball and what is happening to a bouncing ball. And the students using the example of a blueberry pie to describe how the pie is splashing and the blueberry is all over the place. And when you come to hear what the students say, you'd say, wait a minute, like this is fanciful storytelling. I'm not sure this is relevant. And it's very easy to imagine a teacher coming in to say, yeah, that's nice, but let's focus, or tell me how we're going to use this model that we've been focusing on. So in that moment, you could erase and really reduce that student's idea to something that is not valuable. And I hope that epistemic empathy pushes us to empathize at all those levels with learners' experiences. Does that help address the question?
Yeah, that's a terrific answer. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the question.
Elisa?
Thank you so much. I came in a little late, so you might have already addressed this. And if you did, just tell me you did. But one of the things that struck me in the examples of Maria and Sandy is that they seem to be in classroom settings that actually did invite them to bring their epistemologies that were shaped by their cultures and identities into the classroom. And so I'm wondering how you think about the intersection of pedagogy and epistemic empathy.
I really appreciate this question, Elisa, and I think that's where that's what motivates my current work, is to think about how can we like when we think about this idea of epistemic empathy and cultivating the empathy for teachers, how can that translate into the kinds of pedagogies and the kinds of interactions that happen in the classroom? So this is one element. If I'm understanding the question well, I think you're asking, what is the intersection, what is the interplay between a teacher's stance of epistemic empathy and the way they enact pedagogies to support learners to bring in their whole selves, their epistemologies, their feelings into the table, right? So that's the empirical question I have, that I have some beginning exploratory data that I'm examining between to kind of get at that intersection. But conceptually, I can make the argument by saying, so again, that's an empirical question, right? To examine how, if we cultivate this stance of empathy and have evidence of it developing and becoming a stable kind of a resource that teachers tap into in their instruction or in their orientation to learners, does that translate and shape their instructional interaction or their interaction within instruction with students? But conceptually, the argument that I make is that if you tap into your empathy and you think of it as a resource for teaching, then part of how you come to view your role as a teacher in interacting with students is first to be curious about what they are bringing to the table. And when you hear something that that at first glance does not make sense to you, or that feel alien, or that feels strange, to use that as a signal, right? So empathy would be the what gives you a kind of a sign to say, I have to make, or I can make a deliberate choice of how I understand and interpret that learner in the moment. And that would maybe perhaps lead you to ask, wait a minute, can you say more about that? Well, wait a minute, I don't think I understand what you're saying, but I'm really curious, tell me more, right? So if you instill that sense of empathy, the teacher hopefully will come to see that part of their role is to put on hold their frames and their expectations and what makes sense to them, and to be able to really value and appreciate and listen to their students in more critical ways and asset-oriented ways. And that hopefully will shape how they decide to respond. That would be the blue part, where they're responding to affirm learners' dignity and honor them as whole human beings, with the assumption that they have something interesting and valuable to bring to the conversation.
Can I just follow up very quickly? Sure. I mean, it strikes me that you're talking in sort of a linear direction, that if you have epistemic empathy, then it can inform your responses. But I also think your responses, or the way you create context in the classroom, enable you to hear those kinds of things that you can have empathy towards. So to me, it's very circular rather than linear. So you have to have a pedagogical context that allows the students to say things towards which you can have empathy. And then if you have empathy, it gives you a place to go from there. So yeah, I was just kind of curious how you see those relationships.
Yeah, no. I think that's a wonderful point, Alicia. I appreciate you bringing it. Is it Alicia or Elisa? Sorry.
It's Elisa. But
Elisa,
yeah.
all right. I appreciate you bringing that. And I definitely agree that you need the context to be able, because if you're in a place where learners do not even have opportunities to share anything because they're positioned as the recipient, or, you know, like you could imagine spaces where learners are not very much either encouraged or feel that this is the space for them to kind of bring in things, then probably you will not have the opportunity to be able to do the empathizing work because you don't have access to their experience. So I think that thinking carefully about not only the interaction moment to moment, but also designing those learning environments with the use of tasks that could be generative, that could be positioning students, the use of ambiguous data sets, the use of, you know, like thinking about the design of tasks, thinking about norms and practices at the level of the classroom, of how students are positioned, are all also important. So I do appreciate you bringing it, or you're pushing me to think about a representation that is more reflexive, I think, between those responding and empathy and empathizing. I appreciate that. I see, Aaron, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I was just curious how just trying to unpack this. What does it mean to be empathetic towards these students, in particular, if they are bringing in things where you can be empathetic where they're coming from, but the concepts or the ideas themselves are not things you want to be empathetic towards, like conspiracy theories, like racism or something like that. How do you sort of approach that in a way where you can actually be effectively empathetic towards them, but not reinforce or seem to rationalize those mindsets?
Yeah. Excellent question. I feel like you've been sitting with me for a while, because this is in my abstract that I sent to Dr. Duncan. I said that part of what I hope to get at is the discussion of the tensions that emerge in this work. Tensions with respect to the need to differentiate, right, between thinking about epistemic empathy, not as a synonymous for radical acceptance, right? And then how do we make those demarcations? How do we, who gets to decide that as well, right? And if part of part of the goal of thinking about this notion is in service of a more socially just vision and for science education and a more equitable way of thinking about science education, then part of what needs to be done is, in addition to empathizing, sometimes there's the work of challenging and pushing, right? So that there's a work of disrupting particular normalized assumptions about who has been traditionally successful in science and the stereotypes that pervade that, right? Like if you have a student come in, or if there's some sense of, you can sense that there's some stereotype about particular students not being good at science, Black students not being good at science, right? And some sort of voice in the classroom that's been presenting that perspective. You as a teacher, what does it mean to empathize with that perspective? Versus what does it mean for, right, to push against certain harmful discourses happening. So I think this is part, these are key tensions that I sit with in this work as I think about the potential, how to say, pitfalls perhaps of thinking about empathy, the need to nuance, one, that empathy is not radical acceptance, that empathy, if it's a tool and is in service of a vision for social justice, then there needs to be places where dominant discourses need to be put in check, right? To make more room and space for other voices and legitimize other voices. So there's some disruption work that needs to be happening. And this is again where I feel like some of the work of Deborah, the notion of discretion and the use of discretionary spaces and the power that lives in those moments of responding in ways that could either sustain certain patterns of oppression and exclusion or trouble them plays a big role. So I'm not really answering your question, but I'm sitting with it and saying, yes, I hear you. And this is part of the tension that I wrestle with in my work with teachers and in my conceptualization of those notions.
So I don't know how much more, I don't want to stop you from going on, because
yes.
I want to make sure we also get to hear what else you have, but
yes, sure. Yes. So the next part is what I hope to kind of share a little bit more about where we are in our current thinking. I say we because I work with a group of people, wonderful postdoc, Shannon Gooden-Davidson, who's working with me as a postdoc on this project and has been phenomenal, and grad students who I've had the opportunity to work with in this and continue to work with. So some of the things that we're working on is developing or continuing to develop our current conceptualization of epistemic empathy as this constellation of, and I think I spoke a little bit about it when I was responding to some question, that first, there needs to be this disposition where you're orienting to learners with the assumption that they are sense makers, that they with an asset-based orientation, with a stance of curiosity and humility about what you know and what you don't know about them. And then also that this empathy is not only residing at the conceptual level or the cognitive element of their thinking, but also to understand how the affect and other aspects of who they are as people are coming to play in their experiences. So as I think about those constellation of these clusters or domains of empathy, some of the things that we've been turning our attention to see, like, again, as I said, part of the goal of this project is to work on designing educative opportunities to cultivate epistemic empathy. So some of the things that we're looking for that excites us when we see evidence of are examples of these bullets that I'm going to talk a little bit about, and then showcase or maybe walk you through some examples of how we're seeing those in interaction with some of the educative materials that we've been designing in this project to cultivate epistemic empathy. So I decided today, instead of like presenting a paper or a specific study, to kind of have a more general opportunity, like an opportunity to have a more general talk, because I feel like I was selfishly thinking that would be also very productive for me, because these are ideas in formation. This is work in progress. So, so some of the things that we're looking for that get us thinking, ooh, that's cool, something is happening for our teachers, are moments where they express curiosity and interest in learners' reasoning and experiences, moments where they notice learners' epistemic affect and come to see that as part of the work of thinking and learning science, and then interpreting moments where they are putting on hold their judgment, even when something that is weird or strange happened, and then they're trying to work to interpret and explain where learners are coming from. And moments where they explicitly identify productive beginnings or merits in learners' ideas and feelings, and seeing those as part of the nascent work that learners are engaged in the science. As well as moments where they're anticipating learners' ideas. So this is where they kind of try to project and say, oh, if I, like Sandra next might say this, or I can imagine Sandra responding to Daniel in this way, right? So they're kind of pausing to see what they could anticipate. Or yeah, this students would have felt this way after the students has responded to them in that way. And then lastly, and this again speaks to some of the tension, this last point that I'm mentioning, channeling one's personal experiences to connect with learners' emotional and intellectual experiences. There's again risk there. I think, Aaron, your point about, I mean, I'm extending your question a bit, but to me, there's sometimes when we empathize, there's a tendency to empathize with people who think like us and talk like us and look like us, more so than others in the work of understanding where they're coming from. So there's channeling one's personal experience to connect to someone else is a double-edged sword. Sometimes we use it in a very productive way in service of understanding another, and sometimes we use it in ways that could be really implicating our own personal experience on some other person. So that's kind of be self-centered instead of empathetic. So I say that with caution. So what I'd like to do next is to walk you through some of the activities that we're working on. And again, this is work in progress, and we're hoping to develop and continue to develop and refine some of those constellation of educative material that we're developing for others to kind of also examine and use as they see fit. I will say that I'm very grateful for our community at large for the many resources that are made available through people's scholarship, through people sharing of generous videos of classroom practice, examples of student thinking. So all of that, I'm pulling on many different sources in our generous community to put together this work. So right now what we're realizing is a constellation or a cluster of different activities happening in tandem have been very powerful for our learners, for our teachers, to develop their epistemic empathy. And when I say teachers, this includes people or in-service science teachers, as well as pre-service science and math teachers that I've been working with also in the context of teacher education in my position in the School of Teacher Education. So it's both in-service and pre-service to different degrees. So one of the things that we're doing is to really engaging in the work of reading about diverse ways of knowing and thinking. And there's been some excellent, so what I was thinking to do is to give you some examples of our pre-service and in-service teachers' responses to some of the readings that we've done to showcase the beginnings of empathy or the evidence of how we see epistemic empathy developing for them. Here's an example. We read Warren and Roseberry using everyday experience to teach science. And this teacher noticed how Zina's idea, Zina, who was an emergent language learner, was having some difficulties to express their thinking, but using nonverbal cues were able to really present and communicate effectively their thinking. And reading this example led our teachers to wonder how many of Tina's good ideas might be stifled if she were to have a teacher that underestimated her capacity to reason simply because of a language barrier. So this is where we see kind of the beginning of orienting to learners with this more asset-based way. There are plenty of examples with readings. I have put together 3. I think I have time to kind of walk through some of them here. We'll see. Here's another example from a lovely piece by Cindy Ballinger and Carpenter, where 2 students were talking about growth, plant growth, and student Elena brings in this way of thinking about growth in ways that are very imaginary and embodied, and draws on her experience with feeling the socks becoming like crinkle on her feet when they're small, and talking about growth as this ongoing thing that we notice. So really bringing in very interesting ways of thinking about growth that the teacher may not have seen as scientific or mathematical because they're not drawing on the data of the graph. But through this reading, our teachers come to appreciate that many of the students who are from backgrounds, and Elena was an immigrant and of a low socioeconomic background, and talking about how her experience, as many of other students' experiences, that bring valuable and insightful talks to the discussion into the class and should be recognized. So talking about Elena's contribution as valuable because she invited a new way of thinking about growth and promoted a deep discussion. Coming back to this piece of the blueberry pie, and I will say this is both a reading and a video associated with it, and it's really, really nice. I'd be happy to share it. This is from work from Periscope, a recent piece by, not so recent now, 2017, yes. Amy Robertson and Leslie Atkins Elliott, All Students Are Brilliant, a confession of injustice and a call to action. Where again, listening, presenting this or talking and unpacking the brilliance of the student in drawing on this blueberry pie example and animating it the way he was doing, what that afforded for the physics conversation. Reading that piece allowed our pre-service teachers to come to see that when we really listen to what students have to say, we come to see the validity in the points that they are making, and their abilities to learn and engage in science become clear. So again, we see the development here of this stance of curiosity and empathy for learners. So another thing that we're finding very powerful is, as it's happening with these other activities, is engaging in meaningful experiences in science as learners, because many of our pre-service and in-service teachers have not had opportunities to experience science in disciplinary, meaningful ways, had not had the chance to wrestle with the kinds of feelings and emotions that come up for them in science. So we're finding that providing extended opportunities for them to do science in these ways and reflect and interrogate their own assumptions and biases about success in science, about their prior experiences in science, can really be super helpful for them to channel those things to connect with learners in meaningful ways. Here are some examples. This is with in-service teachers, where we met with them to discuss kind of this work, and we engaged them in extended inquiry activities around launch questions. And this teacher is explaining how in the first class, I don't understand what we're supposed to be doing. Why is that in a professional development about learning science, learning to teach science? Why are we thinking about a balloon question for this long? And she explains how lingering with those science questions allowed them to get an idea how the kids are feeling. And when they're feeling hesitant about not writing something, it allowed them to question, like, why do I feel like I'm going to be stupid if I write this? Where is that coming from? And that allowed them to connect to kids and learning from empathy, through empathy, how the way they might be feeling those things may be implicated on their kids when they design their classrooms in ways where answers are expected instead of, uncertainty and wrestling is what they're promoting. And other teachers reflected here on, I don't know if you can see this, the excitement I felt when I was close to figuring out why helium balloons go backward, the feeling of predicting the rainbow experiments, reflecting back on these moments as very powerful for their learning and connecting to their goals of students, saying, if I can get my students to have similar experiences, they would have had a worthwhile 7th grade science class. I'll walk through a couple examples from the use of videos also, as well as the opportunities to engage closely with students. So this is with the videos, we curate these videos intentionally from resources available online and from videos that I've collected in my own research. So this is an example from the video we used. It's available on the Responsive Teaching in Science website. I'd be happy to share these resources of kids thinking through what happens to a cloud when it's raining. And the kids come up with really, really neat models of thinking through this idea of cloud as a rubber band, and then pushing their models, iteratively refining them from a rubber band to a cup overflowing to a sponge. And so our students, our pre-service teachers here in this case, this comes from a pre-service teacher, said how fascinating some of these students' ideas can be. And then connecting again back to their own teaching to say, I will be curious to see what ideas my students come up with for reasoning about science phenomena. Another example here about also noticing all the productive beginnings that students kind of come up with in their thinking and saying that this is mind-blowing. Lastly, in closely interacting with students, we ask our teachers, both in service and pre-service, to take a moment in the day where they're really sitting with a student to inquire about how they think about a science or math question, with an eye towards just eliciting their thinking. So no worry about guiding them somewhere, just be curious about where they are. And those opportunities provide our teachers to really experience and know aspects of their students that they may not have experienced before. It allows them to see, one, for students when something clicks, right? How students can get to experience here in red, what this pre-service teacher talked about as got a glimpse of some of the joys of intuition and understanding that education brings. So again, orienting to the epistemic affect and the power of affect in learning. And this is another example where a teacher is reflecting on how, in hearing all these kids come up with ideas as they engage them with a question, how they felt that students are extremely intelligent and have great potential. So all of those are markers for us that the use of these particular activities are triggering some sort of new orientation, seeing learners in new light, putting on hold biases and assumptions about learners to be able to take this more asset-based oriented view. And I'm going to end with this slide, and I'm hoping we can have some time for chat. I think some of it I've discussed before, but some of the things that I'm hoping to continue thinking about, in addition to refining these educative materials, is how can epistemic empathy that teachers kind of bring to the table in their instruction foster learners' empathy for each other's experiences and perspective, with the goal of really developing more compassionate learning and empathetic learning spaces. So learners can orient to each other with care and curiosity in the same way that teachers are. The tensions that I talked about, there are different ones, and I'm happy to sit with those with others if people are interested. I think I mentioned some of those, especially when it comes to issues of equity. And then really broadly, I think as I started this talk saying that part of what motivates me is to think about how can science education be more humanizing, and what does that mean to be able to be more considerate of people as whole beings in our STEM learning spaces. So I think while this is one way, I'm curious to think about what are other ways that as a field we can continue to recognize and honor the humans in our classrooms. So with that, I would say I have a couple of pieces that were recently published. I decided not to do one presentation on one of them, but I'm happy to share them if people are interested. One of them is in the context of in-service teachers, and one of them is tracing the trajectory of one pre-service teacher. So if people are interested, do feel free to email me. And with that, I'll pause to see if people have questions.
Thank you. This has been really terrific. I hope everyone can show some appreciation and love. This was a really great talk, a lot to think about. And I think we have time for just a few questions. If people have them, I know for us, the tensions that were raised are something that we've been grappling with quite a bit as well. Aaron, you have a question, right?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the comments earlier as well. I'm curious if you have thought at all about like the concerns that often get raised with empathy-based work, where empathy can serve as kind of a cover for projecting one's own mindsets, biases, things like that onto the person that you're sort of trying to understand, to become a kind of shallow mind reading projection sort of activity, how we sort of guard against that on this model.
Yes. Yes, right. When we say, oh yeah, I understand what you're going through because I've been there, right? And I mean, we think that we say that out of love and empathy, and care, but sometimes really that to the other person is like, don't even say you understand what I'm going through, right? Like even in a more generous sense, not necessarily the epistemic work of empathy, but more broadly, what are the risks of projecting one's own experience to the other? And I will say, the way I'm kind of, I'm working through this idea is that as long as we keep ourselves in check about why are we doing the work of empathizing? Is it because we are interested in trying to make someone else understand where we are coming from? Or is it really a genuine, our genuine goal is to be able to tap into that resource, to be able to go and visit someone else's world and understand where they are, right? So I think the intention becomes very, very important there, and to be critically attentive to what are my motives in recruiting my personal experience in a moment to connect to the other. Is it to get them closer to me, or is it to feel better about my situation right now, or is it with the intentional aim of getting at their aspect of the experience? So I think I don't think I have necessarily clear like steps or things in place to kind of guard against that, other than say it's an awareness work, it's an intentional work, and thinking about the motifs behind our actions. It is a key tension for sure. And I'm sorry if I did not time myself one at the end. I feel like I don't know if you end at one or go beyond one. I'm happy to stay if people have interest, if people have questions, but I also want to be respectful of everybody's time.
I think we usually end at one. I think that the stopping and getting questions, I think that was great. And I think a lot of the questions came up then after you presented sort of the theoretical framing. And I know that folks, thank you everyone for coming, and yes, I know folks have to leave, but sure. This was really great. I think we really should connect our group, and Erin, you're welcome. So I know you're thinking about similar stuff. Join that meeting. I think that some of the tensions that you've raised are also things we've been thinking about. We've just recently read the Epistemic Justice piece that David wrote, and been thinking about that. So I think there's sort of a lot going on in this area that would be worthy of exploring further, but not today.
It would be great. I'd be happy to kind of join another meeting with your small group or have conversation. I'm excited for the work that you all are doing, and I think that there could be lots of possible ways of intersecting some ideas, especially with this push really in the field. Like, it's an imperative now that we cannot think about these issues without connecting to issues of justice, right? So yes. I appreciate work that is also pushing us in this direction, and the problematizing that needs to happen as we engage in this work, right? There's power to it, but there are pitfalls, and to keep ourselves in check of like, what are the affordances and what are possible limitations or really harm that could happen unintentionally. So that's something that is on my consciousness.
Yes. Yeah. As I think that's exactly the point, that sometimes we do things out of what we perceive to be care, and it can backfire in some sense. So yeah, a lot to think about, really. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.